I will have with me on stage Clara Chappaz. She is the director of Mission French Tech, the French administration in charge of supporting the growth of the French startup ecosystem and part of the Ministry of Economy and Finance. And Sammy, he is the head of climate at Tech Nation, a platform to support the growth of tech companies and leaders, and co-creator of Tech Zero, a collaborative initiative to achieve the net zero goals. So please, Sammy, Clara, join me on stage. Thank you both for having you here. I think something we can start discussing, an easy topic, because it's what I was saying, one of the key enablers to reach this sustainable transition is technology and innovation. So I would like to ask both of you, but maybe let's start with Sammy. What are the current climate technology trends and which areas we should be focusing more our attention at?
Yeah, thanks a lot. And it's great to be here as well. I think to give some kind of global context, I think over the last 10 or so years, we've seen this kind of exponential shift, positive shift in climate tech. So in 2010 in the UK, for example, I think we had about 300 or so climate tech startups. And today in the UK, we have just over 5,000. Globally, in 2010, I think we had 10,000. And now we've got over 60,000 climate tech startups. So that exponential shift is there. And also, if you look at, from an investment perspective, you really do see this kind of hockey-like curve from 2019 to 2022. So in 2019, I think we had globally $27 billion invested into climate tech, and today we've got just over 100 billion. Last year, we saw the first kind of down round, mainly due to kind of macroeconomic issues. But in 2023 already, or 2024, sorry, already, that's kind of back up. And it's also great to see both France and the UK kind of leading the charge. The kind of quarterly results have just came out in terms of funding, and both the UK and France are #1 currently globally. So just over £5 billion has been invested, which is great. However, it's a great question in terms of looking at the right areas, because we are, I mean, globally, you have energy and mobility, which are heavily funded, and I don't think there's ever enough funding to go into the electric transition, the energy transition. However, across the built environment and agriculture and food systems is definitely where a lot more of the funding needs to come from. And in the built environment, we've had some success in H2 green steel. So they're creating essentially green steel from green hydrogen. So that's been one example of a great success. But I think the built environment is definitely an area which needs to be prioritized. And yeah, agriculture and nature.
Mm. Great. For us, actually, we see exactly the same trend, and we are very excited about this trend. I think a few years back, the French tech was created back in 2013. Climate tech was kind of something where people were not really considered business people, were kind of looking at innovation and like trying and launch something around climate. Today, the ecosystem has grown so much and is actually the most active ecosystem in France for tech. Last year alone, 30% of the funding that happened in France went to climate tech, which is amazing. There's, as you said, also close to 5,000 startups in France, and those startups are the ones that are recruiting the most. So we're seeing a real acceleration. And I think we're seeing it all across Europe, and that's something we're really excited about. When you look at the number of funding you talked about globally, actually 60% of this funding is going to Europe when it comes to climate tech, because we're uniquely positioned to tackle those challenges. We have the talent, we have the interest to actually go after those challenges, and we have the funding now. So it makes us really well positioned. And obviously the question is, okay, climate tech is great, but where should we focus? I think the first really hopeful thing we're seeing in France is we have startups looking at all the value chain and looking at solving all the problems that we're seeing in climate. So this is this complementarity of startups that I think is interesting, because it gives us a very varied array of areas where we're seeing huge opportunities. So it's very hard for me to select, but if I could pick 3 or maybe 4 themes that and we're very excited about right now, is obviously new energy. We have startups in France like Dualsun looking at solar energy, or Life looking at hydrogen, who are developing extremely well. You talked about mobility, a lot of startups doing extremely well in this field. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about Vercor, which is building a giga factory in the north of France to build electrical batteries here in Europe. But you have also a lot of startups in this field, like Electra, Zplug, looking at how to connect electrical cars to this electrical energy. And maybe to say two more, one would be around sustainable materials. We're seeing more and more startups like Hofmann looking at how to create decarbonized cement, because cement is one of the industries that is polluting the most. Actually, it's 8% of total emission. So if we can create those new materials, we can make huge impact. Or lag tips with plastic are other examples. But there's maybe one thing that we don't always talk about that I think is as important is the use of data. We're in France. You know, France has been doing quite a lot when it comes to AI and the use of data, because we have so much talents coming from this field. And it's great to have new energies, but if we don't measure and we don't try and optimize how we consume the energy, I mean, it's also a waste of opportunity and a waste of resource. So we're also seeing really exciting companies. Some of them were here this morning, like Metron, which are looking at how to measure the energy consumption in all the buildings, the factories, the plants, tertiary buildings, to make sure we first understand how we consume, but also optimize it. And that's also a very important trend, in my opinion.
Thank you. And I like it very much that you already share some examples and talking about startups, because many times these technologies, these innovations come from startups. I know both of you work with a startup ecosystem. So a natural next question will be, and again, I can ask it to both of you, but maybe I will start with Clara. We know that these startups need that ecosystem to flourish. So how we can create this positive ecosystem between the entrepreneurs, the investors, the corporations, and the governments?
It's a very important question, because we believe, and we've believed this since 2013 when the Mission French Tech was created, that we need to work together. We're facing tremendous challenges. We're having talented entrepreneurs, huge ambitions. There's only one way we can succeed, is by bringing together the government, the entrepreneurs, the investors, talents, but also non-profit organizations, so that we can all of us help each other to see what are the things that are preventing the startup to grow faster, what can we work on. That's how some of the plans we're talking about, climate tech. There's a plan in France for climate tech, or for deep tech, because a lot of the startups are deep tech, operated by BPI. Because we had this close relationship with the ecosystem, because we had the information from the startups on where are the gaps into their funding journeys, we could put together this type of plans at the government level and try and help the startups. And that's, I think, the key to kind of bringing everyone together, but also bringing corporates within this ecosystem, because it's not just a startup question. If the startups are building the best innovation on the planet, but they're not selling to the companies that are polluting the most, I'm talking, for example, of new materials or software to optimize your energy consumption, it's not going to have a real impact. So that's something we've been really focused on over the last few months, 9 months actually, is also how to bring the corporates, how to bring the public administration, those big spenders, into this ecosystem to make sure that we can help startups find just simply clients.
Yeah, I mean, that on the corporate side is a really good point. I think educating multinationals and to essentially increase adoption rates is really important. But I think in general, the UK and France, I think, have both really good ecosystems. The other stakeholder I'd put in is universities as well, because if you go through, for example, the general funding cycle of a startup, at pre-seed, you often have university spin-outs, or you'll have venture builders. So across the UK, you've got ones like Carbon 13. In France, you've got ones like Marble, and they help you to get, really get off the ground, get that first round of funding in. And then at that seed stage, you'll look probably at VCs. You might look at some grant funding. At Series A, you'll look predominantly probably at VC. And then from Series B onwards, you'll probably look at a combination of venture capital, maybe some debt financing, and maybe a bit more grant funding as well. So I think every single kind of stakeholder is really, really important to that mix. And I think we've made a lot of progress in joining the dots between public, private partnerships. I think one of the areas that we're currently quite focused on is on universities especially, and the amount of equity they take from startups. It's been a big debate over the last year or so, because often universities, because they're giving their IP, they often take around between 10 and 40% of equity, and I think that often does hinder the growth of startups in general. So we're looking to hopefully form some sort of standardized consensus where ideally universities don't take so much IP, because often these are really high impact, hardware intensive or life science-based solutions that often have some of the biggest impacts as opposed to software-based solutions. But I'd say in general, I think the accelerator ecosystem in the UK is very strong. I remember when I started at TechNation in 2020, I think we were probably one of the only climate tech accelerators, and now I think there's over 50 or so. So the growth has been very strong. So even for us, we're looking constantly for our unique selling point. One of those is definitely bringing in the corporates. I think that the education piece is really fundamental, because the biggest challenge is when companies get to Series A, once they've proven out their technology, they've got funding, to get that kind of Series A funding where you're commercially ready, but you don't have, let's say, enough funding to scale out your first factory. I think that's where you need some advanced market commitments from corporates to really take a lead and say, even though this isn't ready yet, in 5 years' time, we're going to adopt this solution that's going to help us decarbonize by X%. So that's really another area we're focusing on.
Yeah, I may recover later the topic of corporates, how easy it is to onboard them, because I think it's very relevant. But you were also now mentioning all how companies get diluted, even at the spin-off stage with the university and then all the next funding rounds. How critical is investment at this stage? And when we were talking a couple of weeks ago, preparing this session, discussing how much the private funding decreased last year, but still public funding is out there. I would like to ask you next then, how do you think this public and private investment should be interlinked to make the most out of it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it comes back to that kind of, I guess, that Series A stage of investment, which is really important, particularly for hardware and life science. Currently, there's lots of grant funding options available. So in the UK, we have Innovate UK, which is, I think, supported about 70% of all the companies we've supported today. You've got Horizon funding and the EU Innovation Fund as well, which are really strong. But I think where it can be improved is often the grant funding is typically very good for when you've got an early TRL level, so when your technology is still evolving, you still haven't quite reached the point of commercialization. We've seen a lot of drop-off where there's not enough grant funding when the technology is availably ready and the company is ready to go to customers. I've seen one example recently is a company called Small Robot Company, and they created autonomous electric tractors to decarbonize agriculture. And they recently very sadly closed down, but not really to their own fault, because they had a pipeline of customers. They proved out their technology, but they just couldn't raise that Series A funding to bridge that gap. So to build out a factory, create a lot more of their robotics that help farmers. So I think that's where the gap can be plugged, and I think there's a lot more kind of grant funding opportunities there, and also kind of public-private partnerships as well. So, for example, with advanced market commitments in carbon removal, you've seen Frontier, who, if you're familiar, they've created about a £1 billion advanced market commitment for carbon removals, and companies like Meta and Apple have all put in hundreds of millions of pounds into it. And I think I'd love to see the same for emissions reduction and also biodiversity and waste as well, because really that's where we need to focus most of our attention right now. So I think it's that combination of advanced market commitments, basically demand signaling from corporates, coupled with subsidies and grants to support that.
Yeah, that's exactly the route that we've tried to kind of push for in France. So we're lucky that we have quite a few public funding plans, a very significant one. I think on stage later you'll have Bruno Bonnel, who's heading France 2030. It's 54 billion euros, not only for climate tech, but half of it is going to climate tech. Looking at really planning what are the technologies we need by 2030 and going supporting the development of those technologies. As I said, BPI also, our public bank, has quite a few of those funding plans and operates those to get the startup the access to the public funding they need. You talk about industrialization and opening your first factory. That's one of the things we saw was the most difficult for startups. Mm-hmm. Not only is there a startup, not only is there often deep tech startup, but also they have to open a plant. It's a lot of commitment you need to ask private investors and conviction you need to ask from them. So we created this, the government created this plan to help startup fund their first factory, called the First Factory Plan. And there's 500 million dedicated to it, and every 6 months, 15 to 20 companies receive funding from that. But it's not enough, because obviously you can't create a dynamic tech ecosystem based only on public funding. I don't think it'd be great for anyone. So one of the things that France has been very focused on is also how do we get private investors chip in? How do we get their interest into the venture capital world? And one of the initiatives that was very positive is called TB, where the government managed to convince private institutional investors, banks, insurance funds, pension funds to go and commit 6 billion the first time, 7 billion the second time euros towards VCs, so that we can fuel the private side as well. And where we are seeing I think one of the best example of that combination, I talked about Vercors earlier, is on some of the mega rounds that we need to build those gigantic factories. We've seen both VCs come in, the state comes in, but also some of the institutional investors like Crédit Agricole come in directly. And this is where I think we start to have all the ingredients to make those big investments come together.
Many ideas here of how to make it work. Again, and now I would like to ask you this question, because not only investment is important, of course, for startups. So we need to think beyond that. And I know at Mission French Tech, you have many programs, many different programs for startups. So what startups do you think needed the most beyond investment, and how it should be delivered to them?
So you should ask them if we're doing our job correctly or not. but what we realized is, of course, yeah, investment is great. It's one very critical piece of the success, especially for this type of technology. But spending this time with companies, we also figured out that there's a lot of time they spend on things that are sometimes complex in France, like administrative issues, where we can also help. And so back in 2019, we created our first program. And last year, we unveiled our latest program based on deep tech technologies called French Tech 2030, where basically the startups, so it's 125 startups, half of them are in climate tech. They're the highest potential startups in their respective technologies. And we try and help them first getting access to direct support. So I think I've seen some of them in the room, but we have account managers in the team who are like their direct entry point towards every matter they can have with the state. So it can be a visa issue, can be a regulation issue, can be a tax reimbursement issue. So we can help them navigate this state thing that sometimes is a little bit complex. That's one. Two, we try and give them visibility. So making sure that they can be here with us on some events like Change Now. They can come to some of the government delegations. Some of them were in India just a few weeks ago. Because it's important, because it gives them credibility, it gives them access to investors, clients, talent. So it helps them raise their attractivity. And the last thing is trying and help them find those opportunities. I talk about corporates. That's something we've been really focused on in the last few months, like how to try and understand. So this morning we had a breakfast with 8 corporates and 18 startups, how to match the startups we know very well with the needs of the corporates, and how to facilitate those connections is also something we're trying to help with. Yeah, it's just obviously we're one of the actors. You have the incubators you mentioned, you have accelerators, you have, but we think that the state also has something to do to accelerate beyond funding.
If you want to complement with some of your programs and activities.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it sounds fairly similar to a lot of the work we do. I mean, we work with mainly seed stage climate tech startups, and we essentially help them access, a lot of the time, really successful later stage entrepreneurs who basically share back their learnings to hopefully just help them, whether it's scaling up their operations, understanding the hiring process of when you go from C to Series A, and also international expansion as well. We do a lot of support to help companies expand from the UK to the US, to Asia, to other parts of Europe as well. And then also access to funding as well. So we try and help startups really access the UK funding market and also the international funding market as well. So connecting them to relevant top-tier investors, both generalist investors, the likes of Sequoia and Axel, through to really kind of high-impact investors as well, both in the UK and Europe. So we really try and kind of handhold them on that investment piece. We do the same on the corporate side as well. And then in 2021, we also launched the Climate Tech Policy Coalition. So we're trying to become the kind of voice for founders at the policy table. So really understanding what are the main regulatory barriers facing climate tech companies in the UK. And then we will present kind of the main findings to government in a hope that they are enacted. So hopefully this year they are enacted. We'll see. We've actually got 28 live recommendations, and so far 3 have been successful. So another 25 to go, and I think we'll be there.
Just building on what you just said on the importance of building the collective, I think that's something we've also seen and trying to emphasize is there's everything we can do as the administration, but there's everything, and sometimes it's actually even more important, that startups can do for each other. And oftentimes, and I've been an operator in startups for close to 10 years, oftentimes there's a very good chance that if you're asking yourself a question about how to go international, how to, I don't know, navigate whatever issue with your investor or your board, attract this or that talent, there is another company at a similar stage as you are that is probably wondering about the same question. And there is probably a company that has been through this journey that also has a lot of learnings to share. So that's something that we've tried and put together, this sense of belonging, of community, and just simply learning from each other, and not just like facilitating state and startups. And this is really exciting because I think this helps us to just work collectively, like as an ecosystem, as you said, and just gain a lot of time.
No, it's true. It's very important, no? How you nurture this network of startups, how you invest on them, how you build this network around them. But is it enough? Or, and I know it's a broad question and big one, but what should Europe do to be at the forefront of innovation to reach its net zero goals?
Yeah, it's a big question.
I know.
I don't think we collaborate enough with each other. I think if you look at some of the 4 major hubs in Europe, Paris, London, Brussels, Amsterdam, they're all within 4 hours of each other. And I feel like there's a lot more we could do and a lot more learnings we can share. I think, I'm not overly familiar with the French policy environment, for example, but I'm pretty familiar with the UK policy environment. And I'm sure there'll be tax incentives, there'll be regulations, there'll be subsidies that I think we can definitely learn from each other. So I think that's one step. I think in terms of grant funding and public funding and VC funding as well, I think especially on the grant funding side of the EU Innovation Fund and Horizon, when I look at the grant funding space in the UK, so many startups take Innovate UK funding, which is the UK funding's body, and I haven't seen too much from the EU Innovation Fund into the UK, so I think there's a lot more that can be done there as well. But yeah, in terms of Europe being a global superpower as well, I mean, we are at the forefront of net zero for sure. But when you look at the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, they are pumping something like $250 billion into climate tech, and we're not at that scale yet. And I think we're coming close. Horizon, I think, has almost a 75 billion euro fund. But I think when you look at the amount of subsidies coming from the US, the incentives to scale to expand to the US as well, I think there's a lot more we could do to not quite replicate that model, but put the same amount of resources as they're doing there.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with everything you've just said. I think a few ideas. The first one is definitely like playing European. It's great that we have all those initiatives in France and that you have all those initiatives in the UK, but like, truth to be told, we are not going to build giants if we think about our national own markets. We have a huge opportunity to create European champions, and definitely a lot we can learn from each other. We were chatting about this before going on stage, and this is still something that there's been a lot of initiatives, like back just before France got the EU presidency, there was a big initiative called Scale Up Europe, where we gathered all the scale-ups and try and see how we can help and facilitate their journey. And not surprisingly, they all had the same issues. So continuing into this direction, continuing to bring together those ecosystems, I think will help us grow stronger compared to what we can see in the US or in Asia. Definitely one area of progress. The second one you talk about it is funding. It's great, we're making a lot of progress, but truth to be told, when you look at fundraising in Europe above 100 million, there's not that many European funds. So we now have a fund of fund at a European level from the Scale Up Europe initiative, where France, Germany, Spain, Italy, all the governments committed 4 billion euros to fuel the growth VCs. But it's still not enough. And we need to see some of those big bets, some European funders going, European VCs going after those big bets. We have Mistral in AI in France, and in the last fundraising round, most of the funds came from American funds. So getting this deep pockets, but also the conviction to go after those big rounds, I think is important. And maybe the last idea, which is similar to this one, is I think we still need to, we've made a lot of progress, but we still need to learn how to market ourselves better. We have the biggest climate tech ecosystem here in Europe, and I don't think we hear enough about that. I think we're still very European when it comes to being very humble, but the truth is that this game is a global game where there's a lot of people bragging around having best technologies, best whatever, but we do have the best here. And if we jointly learn how to talk more about it, I think we can see a lot of great things happening.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe some other countries are much better on that, on showing off. I think we have still a couple of minutes left, so it's a question that I would like to ask to you both again, maybe to answer it in 1 minute. Maybe starting with Sammy, because some of the discussions we thought maybe one of these answers can be to one of these questions, is that maybe we usually talk all the time around the same topics and so on. So why not to ask you, ask you both, would you like to bring to the spotlight something that is not usually discussed, but do you think it's still relevant?
Yeah, I think there's, I guess, two answers to that question. Actually, a lot of this topic's been covered by Change Now, which is good to see, but it's on oceans. So, I mean, we're thankful to the ocean for 25% of carbon sequestration. And there's a few people, I think, in the audience who I've talked to a lot about this, which is, I've talked a lot about whales before, but I'm talking today about seagrass. So seagrass makes up about 0.1% of the seabed, but it accounts for about 18% of carbon sequestration of oceans. And in the UK, a report came out, I think just last week, talking about how seabed decline in the UK was at 97%. So I think in terms of, this is, I guess, almost aside from startups, or there hopefully are some startups looking at restorative work, but just protecting what we already have is really important. We've had huge sewage issues as well in the UK, which has not helped with that aspect. So one is seagrass, and second is food waste. It accounts for about 7% of global emissions. Even where I live in the UK, in southwest London, we still don't have a food waste bin, even though the majority of boroughs of London you do. But these easy wins should be standardized. It's a fairly simple solution for a local council to integrate food waste. So food waste and seagrass.
I'm not going to take the technical route, but more going back to what we can all do to accelerate this movement, and going back to corporates. So we obviously talk about it, but I don't think we act enough yet. And I'm sure in the rooms there are a lot of people working for corporates. So if I can have one wish, is that you take the time here at Change Now to meet those startups and not think about open innovation projects or proof of concept or all those buzzwords, but really think, okay, I have these challenges, I want to buy the best solution on the market those startups do have some of the best solutions. So look at them in a way where they can be your clients, they can be your partners, and they are real businesses because they have so much to bring to your companies. So, and hopefully we'll see a lot of business happening from ChangeNOW as well.
I like these last two messages. I'm perfectly on time. So thank you very much, Clara and Sammy, for these nice insights that they share. Let's give them a round of applause.